The night in Ouagadougou carried an unusual silence, as if the city itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something extraordinary. The streets of Burkina Faso's capital were bathed in the amber glow of streetlights, casting long shadows that danced with the gentle evening breeze. President Ibrahim Traoré had arrived at the Grand Dandy Pond Hotel, one of the city's most luxurious establishments, for a highly classified security meeting. The weight of national responsibilities hung heavy on his shoulders as his motorcade pulled up to the gleaming entrance. Inside the hotel's grand lobby, marble floors reflected the soft illumination from crystal chandeliers overhead. The opulence was unmistakable: imported furniture, artwork from across the continent, and an air of exclusivity that seemed to whisper that only the privileged belonged here. Yet moving quietly through this world of luxury was a woman who existed in its shadows, unseen and unacknowledged by most who passed her by. Her name was Naya Coulibaly. She pushed her cleaning cart slowly across the pristine floors, the wheels making barely a whisper against the polished marble. At first glance, she appeared utterly ordinary. Just another worker in a plain uniform, someone whose presence was so commonplace that she had become virtually invisible to the hotel's wealthy guests and even to many of her colleagues. Her hands were rough and calloused, marked by years of hard labor, fingers that had scrubbed countless floors, polished endless mirrors, and cleaned thousands of rooms. They were hands that told stories of struggle, survival, and quiet dignity in the face of constant hardship. But if one looked beyond the uniform, beyond the humble nature of her work, they might have noticed something remarkable in Naya's eyes. There was a depth there, an intelligence that spoke of experiences far beyond the walls of this hotel. Her voice, when she spoke, carried an unexpected gentleness that seemed to reach directly into the heart of anyone who truly listened. Though she worked alone, Naya had a peculiar habit. She spoke to herself as she cleaned, as if practicing conversations with an invisible audience, rehearsing dialogues with a world that had never given her the chance to truly speak. As she wiped down a mirror near the executive elevators, she began her familiar ritual. "Bonjour, Moussi," she said softly in French, greeting her reflection with the name of her people. Then, without missing a beat, her accent shifted entirely. "Karibu sana, mama," she continued in Swahili, welcoming an imaginary guest. Her tongue moved through the patterns of Arabic next, then Hausa, Bambara, Lingala, Yoruba, and even Amharic, 10 languages flowing from her lips as naturally as water from a spring, each one carrying the authentic accent and inflection of a native speaker. It was as if an entire continent breathed within her, as if Africa itself had found a voice in this humble cleaning woman. President Traoré, flanked by his security detail, was making his way through the lobby toward the conference rooms upstairs. He walked with the measured pace of a man accustomed to the burdens of leadership, his mind already running through the agenda for the evening's critical discussions. But something made him pause mid-stride, a sound so unexpected in this place that it cut through his preoccupations like a knife. He heard the woman speaking, her voice carrying the musical cadence of multiple African languages, each transition so smooth and natural that it was like listening to a symphony. The president stopped completely, his security team immediately going on high alert, unsure why their leader had halted. But Traoré's attention was entirely captured by this cleaning woman whose worn uniform bore the stains of honest labor, yet whose voice carried the sophistication of educated diplomats. Slowly, drawn by curiosity and a growing sense of wonder, the president approached Naya. His security detail tensed, but he waved them back with a subtle gesture. Naya, absorbed in her work and her linguistic practice, didn't notice him at first. When she finally looked up and saw the president of Burkina Faso standing before her, her eyes widened in shock. The cloth fell from her trembling hands. "Sister," President Traoré said gently, his voice warm despite his high office. "Forgive me for interrupting your work. But I must ask, where did you learn all of this? How do you speak so many languages with such fluency?" Naya's reaction was immediate and visceral. She shrank back slightly, her body language betraying years of conditioning that taught her to make herself small, to hide her abilities, to never draw attention. In her experience, being noticed often meant trouble. People who stood out were questioned, doubted, sometimes even accused of putting on airs above their station. She had learned to hide her linguistic gifts, using them only in the privacy of her own thoughts or when she was certain no one of importance was listening. But as she looked into President Traoré's eyes, she saw something that startled her even more than his unexpected presence. There was no suspicion there, no judgment or condescension. Instead, she saw genuine curiosity, respect, and something that looked almost like reverence. Her voice, when she finally found it, was barely above a whisper. "Sir, I haven't really learned anything formal. No schools, no proper training." She paused, gathering courage from somewhere deep within. "Wherever fate has thrown me, whatever country or city I found myself in, the people there took me in like one of their own children. They gave me shelter when I had nowhere to go. I lived with them, ate with them, helped care for their children. And in return, they taught me their language, not from books, but from life. From sitting at their dinner tables, from singing their songs, from crying and laughing together." There was a truth in her words that transcended formal education, a kind of learning that happened through shared humanity rather than structured lessons. President Traoré listened intently, and as Naya continued, her story began to unfold. She told him about the war that had destroyed her village, reducing her childhood home to dust and memories. She spoke of fleeing across borders, a refugee passed from one temporary shelter to another, from Niger to Mali, from Mali to Ethiopia, then to Kenya, and eventually back westward. In each place, she had found communities that, despite their own poverty and struggles, had opened their doors to her. She had learned their languages not out of academic interest, but out of necessity and gratitude, absorbing each tongue as a way to honor the people who had saved her life. As Naya spoke, the hotel manager appeared, his face flushed with a mixture of fear and anger. He had been alerted that the president was delayed in the lobby, and discovering that a cleaning woman was the cause of the holdup filled him with horror. The manager was a man obsessed with appearances, with maintaining the hotel's reputation as a place where everything ran smoothly and where staff knew their place, which was to be invisible. "Mr. President, sir, I am so terribly sorry for this." "Interruption!" the manager sputtered, shooting a venomous glare at Naya. "This woman is just part of the cleaning staff. She should not have gotten in your way. I will have her removed immediately and just part of the cleaning staff?" President Traoré's voice had changed. The warmth was still there, but now it was tempered with something harder, something that made the manager fall silent mid-sentence. The president's eyes, which had been so kind when looking at Naya, now turned cold as they fixed on the manager. "This woman speaks 10 languages, Traoré said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable authority that filled the space around them. 10 languages. And you reduce her to nothing more than her uniform? Tell me, manager, how many languages do you speak? How many cultures have you lived within? How many times have you rebuilt your life from nothing?" The manager opened his mouth, then closed it again. His expensive suit and his prestigious position suddenly seemed very small under the weight of the president's words. Traoré continued, and now his voice carried not just authority, but passion, the kind of conviction that comes from deeply held beliefs. "This is precisely what is destroying us. This is why Africa struggles to rise. We walk past our own diamonds every day, thinking they are just stones. We dismiss our most talented people because they don't fit into the narrow boxes we've created. We ignore the wealth of knowledge and experience right in front of us, then turn around and beg for help from foreign countries who don't understand us half as well as our own people do. He turned back to Naya, who stood frozen, tears now streaming down her face. These weren't tears of shame or fear. They were tears of relief, of validation, of years of silence finally being acknowledged. How many times had she hidden her abilities, afraid that showing them would make her seem presumptuous? How many conversations had she witnessed where she could have helped, could have translated, could have bridged gaps, but had remained quiet because it wasn't her place? President Traoré stepped closer to her, his voice becoming gentle again. "Naya," he said, using her name with a respect that made it sound dignified, important. "I have a question for you. Have you ever dreamed of not just taking orders, but giving guidance? Have you ever imagined using your gifts not just to survive, but to lead?" Naya's lips trembled. The question touched something deep within her, a part of herself she had buried so long ago that she had almost forgotten it existed. I used to dream, sir," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I dreamed that people could understand each other. I wanted languages to be bridges instead of walls. I thought maybe, somehow, I could help with that. But when every door stayed closed, when every dream led nowhere, I learned to stop dreaming. It hurt less that way." President Traoré took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, there was a solemnity to his words that made them feel like a vow. "Then today, Naya Coulibaly, your dreams are reborn. The system that tried to hide you, that tried to convince you that you were nothing, that system will now bow before you." Naya looked up, and for the first time in years, there was light in her eyes. The next morning, the sun rose over Ouagadougou with its usual brilliance, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. But within the walls of the Grand Dandy Pond Hotel, the atmosphere was anything but usual. Word had spread quickly through the staff that something extraordinary was about to happen. The lobby was filled with hotel employees, all standing in nervous rows, their uniforms pressed and perfect, uncertainty written across their faces. At the center of the lobby stood President Ibrahim Traoré, flanked by high-ranking security officials and members of his cabinet. The sight of such a gathering within a private hotel was unprecedented. Guests whispered to each other, wondering if there had been a security threat or some kind of national emergency. The hotel staff exchanged worried glances, each wondering if they were about to be accused of some failure or oversight. The manager stood at the front, his smile nervous and forced, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. He had spent the night convincing himself that yesterday's encounter was an anomaly, a brief moment of presidential whimsy that would be forgotten. Surely the president had more important things to concern himself with than a cleaning woman who happened to speak multiple languages. President Traoré waited until the murmuring died down, until every eye in the room was fixed on him. Then, without any preamble, without consulting notes or making lengthy speeches, he made his announcement. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the marble hall. "Naya Coulibaly will be the new director of this hotel." For a moment, there was absolute silence. The words seemed to hang in the air, as if reality itself was taking a moment to process them. Then the silence shattered into a cacophony of gasps, whispers, and exclamations of disbelief. Naya, who had been standing at the back of the crowd in her cleaning uniform, felt the blood drain from her face. Surely she had misheard. Surely the president meant something else. But then all eyes turned to her, and the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The hotel manager's face turned an alarming shade of red. His carefully maintained composure cracked completely. He stepped forward, his voice strangled with barely controlled outrage. "Mr. President, sir, surely there has been some mistake. This woman has no formal education, no management training, no qualifications whatsoever. We have highly qualified staff members, people with degrees from prestigious universities, years of experience in the hospitality industry." "I know exactly what qualifications you value," President Traoré interrupted, his tone cutting through the manager's protestations like a blade. "Pieces of paper, certificates, Degrees that tell you someone sat in a classroom but say nothing about whether they understand people, whether they have empathy, whether they have survived enough of life to truly appreciate what service means. The president's gaze swept across the assembled staff before returning to the manager. This woman possesses wealth that cannot be measured by your standards. She has understanding. She has cultural intelligence. She has the ability to make people feel seen and valued. These are not things you can learn in a university. These are things you earn through living, through suffering, through maintaining your humanity, even when the world tries to strip it away. The hall fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. Some faces showed beginning comprehension, a dawning realization that perhaps they had been blind to what was right in front of them. Others showed resentment, a stubborn refusal to accept that someone they had considered beneath them could suddenly be elevated above them. Naya stood frozen, her whole body trembling. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. She was just a cleaning woman. What did she know about running a hotel, about managing staff, about dealing with important guests and complex operations? "Mr. President," she said, her voice shaking, "I am not worthy of this position. I only know how to clean. I don't have the knowledge or the skills to—" "Naya," President Traoré said, turning to face her directly, his eyes locking with hers. "You have survived wars. You have crossed borders and rebuilt your life multiple times. You have learned 10 languages not from books, but from the deep human need to connect, to understand, to belong. You know what Africa truly needs: someone who listens before they speak, who understands before they judge, who sees the human being before they see the uniform or the title." He paused, letting his words sink in. "That is leadership. Real leadership. And it is far more rare and valuable than any diploma hanging on a wall." Tears welled up in Naya's eyes. "But what will people say?" she whispered. President Traoré smiled, a sad but knowing smile. "People will always say something, Naya. They will question, doubt, criticize. But history doesn't remember the critics. History remembers those who had the courage to act, to change things, to prove that the impossible was possible all along." With those words, he turned and left, his security detail falling into step around him. But his presence remained, his words echoing in the suddenly quiet lobby. Naya stood alone now, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. For the first time in her life, she felt the burden of her own existence beginning to lift, replaced by a different kind of weight, the weight of responsibility, of expectation, of possibility. The first few days were brutal, the staff, outwardly compliant, seething with resentment beneath their professional smiles. In meeting rooms, Naya's every suggestion was met with barely concealed skepticism. When she spoke, eyes would roll. When she left the room, the whispers would start immediately. "Can you believe this? A cleaning woman is now giving us orders. This is just political theater. It won't last. She doesn't even know how to use the computer system properly." The old manager, now demoted to assistant manager, made his opposition particularly clear. He would correct her publicly, question her decisions in front of the staff, and make a show of helping her with tasks she supposedly couldn't handle, all while maintaining a facade of respect that fooled no one. But Naya had not survived everything she had survived by being weak. She had learned patience in refugee camps. She had learned resilience fleeing through war zones. She had learned dignity while scrubbing floors that others walked over without a glance. She began to implement changes slowly, carefully. First, she introduced a new policy. Guests would be greeted in their native language whenever possible. The lobby would play music from different African regions. Staff would learn basic phrases in multiple languages, not just French and English, but Bambara, Hausa, Swahili, Yoruba. Many staff members mocked this initiative privately. "Waste of time," they said. "Guests just want efficiency, not this touchy-feely nonsense." But then something happened that began to shift the dynamics. A delegation arrived from Mali, businessmen there to negotiate a major investment deal. The reception staff struggled with their Bambara dialect, unable to understand their specific requests. The conversation stalled, becoming awkward and frustrating for everyone involved. Naya, who had been observing from a distance, stepped forward. In fluent Bambara, with the exact regional accent of the delegation's home province, she welcomed them warmly. "Welcome, brothers. We are honored by your presence. How may we serve you?" The transformation was immediate and dramatic. The businessmen's faces, which had been growing increasingly frustrated and closed, suddenly opened with surprise and then joy. One of them actually laughed with delight. "Finally," he said, "someone who speaks to us like human beings, not just customers." Throughout their entire stay, those businessmen insisted on working directly with Naya. They praised the hotel to everyone they met. And when they left, they signed a partnership agreement that brought more business to the hotel than it had seen in 6 months. "This hotel made us feel at home," the delegation leader said at checkout. "That is worth more than all the luxury in the world." The staff witnessed this. Some began to understand. Others remained skeptical, calling it a lucky coincidence. But Naya was just beginning. Late one night, Naya sat alone in what was now her office, a room she still couldn't quite believe belonged to her. Through the window, she could see the lights of Ouagadougou, the city that had become her home after so many years of wandering. From the lobby below, she could hear laughter, some of the staff members joking among themselves. A voice carried up clearly. "Yesterday she was pushing a mop. Today she's running meetings. What a world we live in." Another voice, thick with sarcasm. "Give it a month. This experiment will fail and things will go back to normal." Naya felt the sting of their words, but also something else, a quiet resolve that had been building within her. She walked to the window and looked at her reflection in the glass. Behind her reflection, she could see the city, and beyond that, she imagined the entire continent of Africa, filled with millions of people just like her, people with talents and dreams who had been told they didn't matter. "Yes," she whispered to her reflection, "the world is changing, and I'm going to help it change." The next morning, she called a meeting of all the senior staff. They gathered in the conference room, some sitting with crossed arms and skeptical expressions, others looking merely curious about what this upstart director would say now. Naya didn't sit at the head of the table as they expected. Instead, she remained standing, positioned so she could see everyone's face. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but carried an authority that surprised even her. "I know many of you doubt me," she began. "You think I don't deserve this position. You believe my appointment is just political symbolism, a temporary experiment that will fail." She paused, making eye contact with each person in turn. "And I understand why you think that. If our positions were reversed, I might think the same thing." This admission caught them off guard. They had expected defensiveness, perhaps anger. They hadn't expected understanding. "But I want to tell you something about what I've learned," Naya continued. "I've worked in this hotel for 3 years. I've cleaned every floor, every window, every mirror. And while I cleaned, I watched. I listened. I learned things that people who sit in offices and attend meetings never see." She began to walk slowly around the room. "I know which guests are treated well and which ones are dismissed because they don't look wealthy enough. I know which staff members work hardest and which ones hide when there's difficult work to be done. I know where we waste resources and where we cut corners. I know which suppliers cheat us and which ones are honest. I know all of this because when you're invisible, you see everything." The room had gone very quiet. People were actually listening now. "I'm not going to fire anyone," Naya said. "I'm not going to make drastic changes overnight. But I am going to ask each of you to do something difficult." She paused. "I'm going to ask you to respect the people you've been trained to look down on. The housekeepers, the maintenance workers, the kitchen staff. Because they are not beneath you. They are the foundation on which everything else rests. And when we treat them with dignity, they work with pride. And when people work with pride, everything improves." One of the senior managers, a woman who had been particularly dismissive of Naya, finally spoke up. Her voice was challenging, but not entirely hostile. "And you think respect alone will run a hotel? What about efficiency? What about standards? What about the bottom line?" Naya smiled. "I think respect creates efficiency. I think dignity raises standards. And I think the bottom line improves when guests feel genuinely cared for, not just processed through a system." She looked at them all one more time. Give me 3 months. Judge me by results. If this hotel is not better by then, if guests are not happier, if staff morale hasn't improved, if our revenue hasn't increased, then I will step down voluntarily. But until then, I'm asking for your partnership, not your sabotage." The meeting ended in thoughtful silence rather than dismissive chatter. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. Over the following weeks, Naya made quiet but significant changes. She noticed that the elderly security guard, a man named Musa, who had worked at the hotel for 25 years, was always the first to arrive and the last to leave, but had never received any recognition or promotion. She made him the head of the security training program, responsible for mentoring younger security staff. When she announced this, Musa had tears in his eyes. "In 25 years, he said quietly, this is the first time anyone has asked what I know instead of just telling me what to do." She reorganized the housekeeping schedule to give workers more regular hours and better breaks. Productivity actually increased because people weren't exhausted. She started a program where kitchen staff could suggest menu items, drawing on their own cultural knowledge. A simple fish dish suggested by a cook from Senegal became the hotel's most requested meal. Small changes, quiet changes, but they added up. Then came the test that would either vindicate her or prove her critics right. An international conference was scheduled at the hotel. Delegations from Niger, Mali, Senegal, and Chad, along with several European business representatives. It was the biggest event the hotel had hosted in years, and the old management team was certain Naya would fail. They made sure of it. Supplies were mysteriously delayed. Room assignments were confused. The printed conference materials were full of errors. It was sabotage, subtle enough to deny, but obvious enough to derail everything. Naya discovered the sabotage the night before the conference began. For a moment, standing in the lobby at 2 a.m., surrounded by chaos, she felt the old fears returning. Maybe she really wasn't capable of this. Maybe she had been foolish to think she could lead. But then she thought about all the people who were counting on her, not just the staff who had begun to believe in her vision, but all the invisible people across Africa who needed to see that someone like them could succeed. She picked up her phone and started making calls. By morning, through a network of contacts she had built during her years of moving across Africa, she had secured alternative suppliers. She personally corrected and reprinted all the conference materials. She reorganized the room assignments and supervised the setup herself, working alongside the housekeeping staff until everything was perfect. When the delegates began to arrive, they were met with something unexpected. As the group from Mali entered, Naya greeted them personally in Bambara. "Welcome, honored guests. We are not your hosts. You are our family." The Senegalese delegation heard greetings in Wolof. The representatives from Niger were addressed in Hausa. And the surprise on their faces, the way they lit up to hear their own languages in this formal setting, transformed the entire atmosphere of the conference. One elderly statesman from Mali grabbed Naya's hands. "In 40 years of international travel," he said, voice thick with emotion, "this is the first time a hotel has welcomed me in my mother's language. You have honored not just me, but my ancestors." During the conference, Naya didn't try to hide or minimize her presence as a director without formal qualifications. Instead, when asked to give remarks at the opening session, she spoke honestly about her journey. "I stand before you not as someone with degrees or traditional credentials," she said to the assembled business leaders and diplomats, "but as someone who has lived the African experience. I have been a refugee, a displaced person, someone who fell through every crack in every system, and I learned languages and customs not from textbooks, but from the generosity of ordinary people across this continent who took me in, fed me, taught me, and reminded me that I was human even when circumstances tried to convince me otherwise." She paused, looking around the room. "This hotel will serve you excellently because we understand something that no management manual can teach. Hospitality is not a transaction, it is a relationship. When you stay here, you are not just customers. You are guests in the truest sense, people we welcome with our whole hearts." The speech was simple, unpolished by professional standards. but it was authentic, and it touched something deep in the listeners. By the end of the 3-day conference, every delegation had praised the hotel effusively. Several signed contracts for future events. The European representatives, who had come with some skepticism, admitted they had never experienced such genuine warmth and cultural sensitivity. "This is the future of international relations," one of them said. "Not just professional efficiency, but human connection." When the revenue reports came in, the hotel had earned more from this single conference than from any previous event in its history. The staff meeting that followed was different from any that had come before. The old manager, the one who had been most hostile to Naya's appointment, stood up. His face was conflicted, pride warring with the need to admit he had been wrong. "I owe you an apology," he said to Naya, his voice strained but sincere. "I thought this was a political stunt. I thought you couldn't possibly run this hotel. I was wrong. Not just wrong about you, but wrong about what leadership actually means." Others nodded in agreement. The skepticism hadn't entirely disappeared, but it had been cracked open, letting in the first light of possibility. Naya's response surprised them again. She didn't gloat or lecture. Instead, she said simply, "Thank you. But this success belongs to all of us. I couldn't have done it alone. The kitchen staff who worked extra hours, the housekeepers who made sure every detail was perfect, the security team who made everyone feel safe, we did this together. That's the only way anything worthwhile gets done." It was in that moment that the remaining resistance began to crumble. People started to understand that Naya wasn't trying to prove she was better than them. She was trying to prove they were all better than they had been allowed to believe. The conference success might have remained a local story, remembered only within the walls of the Grand Dandy Pond Hotel. But one of the young staff members had recorded Naya's greeting of the delegates in their native languages. He posted the video on social media with the caption, "The woman who speaks 10 languages and connects Africa with her heart." The video went viral. Within days, it had been viewed millions of times across the continent. News channels picked up the story. Newspapers ran features. From cleaning woman to director. Is this the beginning of a revolution? The response was explosive and divided. Some celebrated Naya as a symbol of Africa's untapped potential. Others dismissed her as a token, a feel-good story that changed nothing about systemic inequalities. Western media outlets questioned whether she was being exploited for political purposes by President Traoré. But for millions of ordinary Africans, Naya's story touched something profound. The video comment sections filled with testimonials. "I am a farmer who never went to school, but I understand soil and seasons better than any agronomist. This woman gives me hope that my knowledge matters too. I am a traditional healer who has cured people with herbs for 30 years, but doctors say my knowledge is worthless because I have no degree. Thank you, Naya, for showing that experience is education. I speak 4 languages but work as a driver because I have no certificate. Today I feel seen." The movement that emerged had a name. Ubuntu Uprising. I am because we are. It became a rallying cry for recognizing talent and knowledge that existed outside traditional educational systems. President Traoré, watching this unfold, saw an opportunity to address one of Africa's deepest wounds, the colonial legacy that had taught Africans to devalue their own knowledge, languages, and systems in favor of European models. He launched Project Azali, New Birth. Across Burkina Faso, community centers were established where people could demonstrate and share skills that had never been officially recognized. Language speakers, traditional craftspeople, farmers with deep knowledge of local ecology, herbalists, mechanics who could fix anything despite never having formal training, all were invited to register and teach. Naya became the face of this movement. But she insisted she was just a symbol for millions of others. "I am not special," she said in interview after interview. "I am ordinary." But ordinary doesn't mean worthless. That's the message. Every person has value. Every person has knowledge. We just need to create spaces where that knowledge is respected. The Ubuntu uprising spread beyond Burkina Faso. In Ghana, people created videos showcasing traditional knowledge. In Nigeria, mechanics and craftspeople organized demonstrations of their skills. In Mali, linguistic diversity was celebrated instead of suppressed. But success breeds opposition. Western think tanks began publishing papers warning about anti-intellectual populism in Africa. Some academics argued that Naya's elevation sent a dangerous message, that formal education didn't matter. Conservative voices in Africa itself worried that the movement was going too far, undermining necessary standards. A French newspaper ran a particularly cutting article. President Traoré uses cleaning woman for populist agenda. The article insinuated that Naya was being manipulated, that she couldn't possibly be competent enough for her position, that the whole thing was political theater. When Naya read the article, she felt a familiar old pain, the pain of being dismissed, of having her achievements explained away as luck or manipulation rather than being taken seriously on her own merits. President Traoré called her to his office. She arrived expecting to be told that the backlash was too much, that perhaps it was time to step back, to let things quiet down. Instead, he showed her another article, this one from a university student in Kenya who had written an essay titled, "What Naya Coulibaly Taught Me About the Violence of Credentials." The student wrote, "We have been taught that knowledge only counts if it is certified by institutions that were designed to exclude most of us. We have been taught that our grandmother's wisdom is superstition, that our father's skills are inferior because they lack diplomas. Naya Coulibaly's story doesn't diminish education. It expands our understanding of what education is and where it can be found. That," President Traoré said to Naya, "is why they're frightened. Not because you're unqualified, but because you're proving that the gates they've been keeping locked were never necessary in the first place." He leaned forward, his voice intense. "They want Africa to keep begging for validation, to keep sending our children to foreign universities, to keep believing that our own knowledge and systems are inferior. You threaten that entire structure simply by existing in this role and succeeding. That's why they attack you." Naya felt something shift inside her. The doubt didn't disappear entirely, it probably never would. But it was joined now by something stronger, conviction. "Then we keep going," she said quietly. "Then we keep going," the president agreed. The invitation to address the African Union came 6 months after Naya's appointment as hotel director. It was unprecedented. Never before had someone without political office, without academic credentials, been invited to speak at this level. Some delegates objected strenuously. "She's a hotel manager," they protested. "What can she possibly say that's relevant to continental policy?" But others argued that Naya represented something essential that the African Union needed to hear, the voice of ordinary citizens, particularly women who formed the backbone of African society but were rarely heard in halls of power. The debate itself became news, further elevating Naya's profile. When the African Union finally confirmed her speaking slot, it was seen as either a bold progressive move or a publicity stunt, depending on who you asked. Naya prepared for weeks, but not in the traditional way. She didn't write a formal speech or practice diplomatic language. Instead, she traveled. She went to villages and cities across Burkina Faso talking to people, farmers, market women, teachers, mechanics, traditional healers, young people struggling to find work despite their talents. "What do you want the leaders to know?" she asked everyone she met. "What do you need them to understand?" The answers poured out. Frustration with being overlooked. Pride in skills and knowledge that went unrecognized. Exhaustion from constantly being told they needed to be different, to get more credentials, to prove their worth according to standards that seemed designed to exclude them. "Tell them we exist," an elderly woman said. "Tell them we matter. Tell them we're tired of being invisible." The day of her address, Naya wore traditional Burkinabe clothing, brilliant patterns of red, gold, and green that seemed to capture the essence of the African sunset. She refused the offer of professional stylists and speech coaches. "I will speak," she said simply, "as myself. That is all I have to offer, and it is enough." The African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa was filled to capacity. Flags of 55 nations hung from the ceiling. Diplomats, ministers, and heads of state filled the seats, their faces reflecting varying degrees of curiosity, skepticism, and interest. Television cameras from across the world were positioned throughout the hall. President Traoré sat in the front row, his presence a statement of support. But Naya knew she couldn't rely on his authority. Today, she had to speak with her own voice, carry her own weight. As she walked to the podium, the hall fell silent. She took a moment to look out at the sea of faces. Powerful people, educated people, people who made decisions that affected millions. And she felt surprisingly calm. "My name is Naya Coulibaly," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I am from Burkina Faso, and I represent the voice of African women who have survived wars, poverty, and displacement, yet who kept alive the languages of love, the traditions of unity, and the dignity of our people through it all." She paused, letting her words settle. "I am the woman who used to clean the floors of hotels where you stayed. Today I stand before you not to clean your floors, but to hold up a mirror to your conscience." A ripple went through the audience. Surprise, some discomfort, but also heightened attention. Naya continued, telling her story without embellishment or drama, simply laying out the facts of her life. The war that destroyed her village when she was a child. The refugee camps. The constant movement from country to country. Language to language, always on the margins of society. Always invisible to those with power. "I learned 10 languages," she said. "Not because I was ambitious or talented, but because I wanted to survive. Because I wanted to thank the people who fed me in their own words. Because I wanted to belong somewhere, anywhere. And as I learned each language, I began to understand something. We Africans speak different tongues, but we share the same heart. The same struggles. The same dreams. The same dignity that the world keeps trying to strip from us." She looked directly at the assembly. "My dream was simple. I wanted Africans to speak to each other in languages that connect us, not in languages that were forced upon us to divide us. I wanted the knowledge of ordinary people, the farmers who understand the land, the grandmothers who heal with herbs, the craftspeople who create beauty with their hands. I wanted that knowledge to be valued as much as any university degree." President Traoré's eyes glistened with tears. Others in the audience leaned forward, fully engaged now. "But my dream seemed impossible," Naya continued, "because everywhere I looked, I saw the same pattern. People like me, people with skills, with knowledge, with languages, with experience, we were invisible. We were told that what we knew didn't count because we didn't have papers to prove it. We were told that our languages were dialects, not real languages. We were told that traditional knowledge was superstition, not science. We were told over and over that we needed to become something else, something foreign, before we could be considered valuable." Her voice grew stronger, more passionate. And I believed it. I believed I was nothing. I pushed my cleaning cart and kept my mouth shut and tried to make myself as small and invisible as possible because that's what society taught me to do. She paused, and the silence in the hall was profound. But then President Traoré heard me speaking languages that he valued. And he did something revolutionary. He saw me. Not just my uniform, not just my job title, not just my lack of credentials. He saw my humanity. He saw my capability. He saw potential where everyone else, including myself, had seen only limitations. Naya's voice dropped to almost a whisper, forcing everyone to strain to hear. Do you know how radical that is? To see the humanity and potential in a cleaning woman? To believe that someone without formal education might have something valuable to contribute? To think that maybe, just maybe, we've been looking for our treasures in all the wrong places? The question hung in the air. Africa's greatest wealth, Naya declared, her voice rising again, is not our diamonds or our oil or our gold. It is our people. But we have measured people's worth by their poverty instead of their capabilities. We have let colonial systems convince us that knowledge only counts if it comes from Western universities. We have allowed ourselves to become beggars in our own home, asking others to tell us what we're worth. She stepped out from behind the podium, moving closer to the audience, making the speech feel more like a conversation. Learning can happen anywhere. In a village, in a workshop, in a field, in a grandmother's kitchen. Languages are not barriers, they can be bridges. And capabilities exist everywhere, in everyone. If only we have the courage to recognize them. Then she spoke the words that would become famous, quoted and debated for years to come. Certificates do not guarantee capability. They only grant permission to opportunity. But opportunity should be everyone's right, not just the privilege of those who could afford formal education. The hall erupted in applause. Some stood immediately. Others remained seated but clapped vigorously. A few faces showed disapproval, arms crossed. But even they couldn't deny the power of what they had just heard. Naya wasn't finished. I ask you for a promise today. Recognize the hands that your systems have ignored. See the women who teach in homes but are not called teachers. Acknowledge the young people who repair machinery but are not called engineers. Value the elders who preserve languages but are not called linguists. Because if we continue to worship credentials over capability, we will create a new kind of slavery. A slavery to diplomas and degrees that most Africans can never afford. She looked around the room one final time. I am not speaking for any position or prestige. I am speaking for those whose stories have never been written, whose voices have never been heard, whose worth has never been recognized. I am speaking for every person who has been told they are nothing. And I am here to say you are everything. Your hands, your languages, your sweat, your knowledge, your dignity, these are Africa's true wealth. The standing ovation was thunderous and prolonged. Delegates from across the continent rose to their feet, many with tears streaming down their faces. This was not just a speech, it was a moment of collective reckoning, a mirror held up to systems and attitudes that had long gone unquestioned. That evening, the African Union held an emergency session. The impact of Naya's speech had been so profound that delegates demanded immediate action. After hours of debate, they passed the Ubuntu Uplift Resolution. The resolution committed member nations to establish community knowledge centers, where people could register and teach skills regardless of formal. Credentials create alternative certification, systems that recognized experiential knowledge. Alongside academic qualifications, invest in language preservation programs that valued African languages. As tools of education and governance, not just cultural artifacts, implement fair hiring practices that evaluated candidates on demonstrated capability, not just degrees fund local knowledge documentation projects to preserve traditional wisdom in agriculture, medicine, crafts, and other fields. Naya was named the inaugural director of the Continental Ubuntu Initiative, the program established to implement these goals across Africa. When the news reached Ouagadougou, the city exploded in celebration. Thousands poured into the streets. Strangers embraced. The chant echoed everywhere. We are all Naya. We are all valuable. But Naya's reaction was more subdued. When she returned to Burkina Faso, she didn't go first to the presidential palace or to the hotel. Instead, she went back to the small room where she had lived during her years as a cleaning woman. A cramped space with a narrow bed, a single window, and walls that had absorbed years of her private tears and whispered dreams. She sat on the bed and looked around at the space that had been her entire world for so long. On the wall, she had pinned a faded photograph of her mother, lost in the war that had destroyed their village. She had been 7 years old when she last saw her mother alive. "Mama," she whispered to the photograph, "I did it. I didn't just survive. I found a way to matter. I found a way to make sure others know they matter too." The tears came then. Not tears of sadness or even joy, but tears of release. Of a journey finally reaching a destination she had never dared to believe was possible. Success at the African Union level brought Naya to international attention, and with that attention came intensified criticism. Western media outlets that had briefly celebrated her story now began to question it more aggressively. A New York Times opinion piece titled, "The Danger of Anti-Intellectual Populism in Africa," argued that the Ubuntu movement represented a rejection of educational standards that would ultimately harm Africa's development. The author wrote, "While Koulibaly's personal story is inspiring, the policy implications are troubling. Societies need standards, credentials, and systematic education. Romanticizing informal knowledge may feel good, but it won't build universities, hospitals, or technological infrastructure. A British think tank published a report warning that the Ubuntu initiative could lead to skill dilution and make African workers less competitive in the global economy. European development agencies, which funded many educational programs in Africa, expressed concern that their investments were being undermined. Some African intellectuals joined the criticism. "We fought for access to education," one prominent professor wrote. "Now we're being told education doesn't matter? This is a step backward, not forward. We need more Africans with PhDs, not fewer." The criticism wounded Naya deeply, particularly when it came from fellow Africans. She had never intended to suggest that formal education was worthless, only that it shouldn't be the sole measure of human worth and capability. President Traoré called a press conference to address the criticism. Naya stood beside him, feeling the weight of cameras and questions. "Let me be very clear," Traoré said, his voice firm. "The Ubuntu initiative does not oppose education. We are building more schools, not fewer. We are increasing scholarships, not cutting them. What we oppose is the idea that only formally educated people have value. What we oppose is a system that tells a talented mechanic he is worthless because he doesn't have an engineering degree, or tells a woman who speaks 5 languages she is unqualified because she never attended university." He turned to look at Naya. "This woman standing beside me has done more to improve international relations and cultural understanding at our hotel than any formally trained diplomat. She has inspired millions of people across our continent to believe in themselves. She has sparked a conversation about human dignity that needed to happen. And yet, there are people who insist she is unqualified, who dismiss her achievements as political theater." His voice rose with passion. "I ask those critics, what qualifies someone to inspire? What degree do you need to make people feel seen and valued? What certificate proves you understand the human heart?" A French journalist shouted a question. "But Mr. President, aren't you concerned that this sends a message that education doesn't matter?" Traoré's response was measured but firm. "If Naya's success threatens the value of education, then perhaps education was never as valuable as we claimed. Real education, true education, should expand our understanding of worth, not restrict it. If a degree is only valuable because it lets you look down on those without degrees, then it's not education. It's just another form of oppression." The press conference video went viral, shared millions of times with passionate arguments on both sides. The debate had moved beyond Naya herself to fundamental questions about knowledge, value, and power in African society. Amid the international controversy, Naya made a decision that surprised everyone. She took a leave of absence from her high-profile role at the Continental Ubuntu Initiative and returned to the Grand Dandy Pond Hotel, not as director, but to work alongside the cleaning staff for 1 week. "I need to remember where I came from," she explained. "I need to remember what this is really about." The media descended on the hotel, trying to capture images of this famous woman pushing a cleaning cart again. But Naya refused all interviews during this week. She simply worked. Cleaning rooms, scrubbing floors, changing linens. The other cleaning staff were initially bewildered, unsure how to treat this woman who was now internationally famous, but was working beside them in the same uniform she had once worn every day. But Naya's genuine humility broke down the barriers quickly. On the 3rd day, during a lunch break, one of the younger cleaning women asked, "Miss Naya, do you ever regret accepting the director position? Your life was simpler before." Naya considered the question carefully. "Simpler, yes. Safer, yes. But I was also hiding. I was teaching myself that my gifts didn't matter, that I should stay small and invisible. That kind of safety comes at a terrible cost, the cost of your own soul." An older woman who had worked at the hotel for 15 years spoke up. "I clean rooms and I'm proud of my work. But sometimes I wish someone would ask me what I think about things. I wish my opinion mattered." "It does matter," Naya said quietly. "That's the whole point. Every person in this hotel, from the CEO to the newest cleaning staff, has perspectives and knowledge that matter. The problem is we've built systems that only listen to some voices and ignore others." Another woman, this one middle-aged with tired eyes, said, "I used to be a teacher. In my village, I taught children for 10 years. But I had no certificate, so when I came to the city, no school would hire me. So I clean. And every day, I wonder if I wasted those 10 years. Naya took the woman's hand. You didn't waste anything. You gave children education they couldn't have gotten otherwise. The fact that the city schools don't recognize your worth doesn't erase the worth of what you did. Don't let their blindness make you doubt your own value. The conversation continued, and one by one, the women began sharing their stories. Skills they had, languages they spoke, knowledge they possessed, dreams they had abandoned. This, Naya said, this is what the Ubuntu Initiative is about. Not replacing education, but expanding what we recognize as valuable. Making space for all of this, she gestured around the circle, to be seen and honored. By the end of the week, Naya had reconnected with her purpose. She had also gathered material for what would become her most influential project yet. Inspired by the conversations with the cleaning staff, Naya proposed a new initiative, the Living Library Project. The concept was revolutionary yet simple. People with experiential knowledge would become living books that others could check out for conversations and learning. A young person interested in traditional medicine could spend an afternoon with an elder who had practiced herbal healing for decades. Someone wanting to learn a language could sit with a native speaker. A student interested in agriculture could work alongside a farmer with 40 years of experience. The project launched first in Burkina Faso, with Naya herself as one of the first living books. People could sign up to spend an hour with her, asking questions about language learning, about overcoming obstacles, about maintaining dignity in difficult circumstances. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks, thousands of people had registered as living books across the country. Craftspeople, farmers, musicians, storytellers, herbalists, mechanics, market women, elders with deep cultural knowledge. Schools began incorporating living library visits into their curriculum. University students found themselves learning from people who had never set foot in a classroom. The knowledge exchange began flowing in both directions. Traditional knowledge enriching academic understanding, while academic frameworks helped systematize and preserve traditional practices. One particularly moving moment came when a prestigious university professor of linguistics checked out Naya as a living book. He came skeptical, viewing the meeting as a courtesy to someone who had become famous rather than a genuine learning opportunity, but after 3 hours of conversation about how Naya had learned multiple languages through immersion and necessity, the professor admitted, "You've developed an intuitive understanding of language acquisition that took me 20 years of research to theorize. You weren't just learning languages, you were discovering principles of linguistic flexibility that we're only now beginning to understand formally." He became one of the Living Library Project's most passionate advocates, arguing that experiential knowledge and academic knowledge needed to inform each other rather than exist in separate, hierarchical spheres. The Living Library spread across Africa. In Kenya, Ghana, Senegal, Nigeria, Tanzania, everywhere, people began recognizing and honoring the knowledge that existed in their communities. The initiative helped bridge generational gaps as young people sought out elders they had previously dismissed as old-fashioned. It also created unexpected economic opportunities. Some living books began offering their knowledge professionally, creating new forms of employment. Traditional craftspeople found markets for their skills. Language speakers became cultural consultants for businesses and government agencies. But perhaps most importantly, it changed how people saw themselves. Across the continent, people who had believed they were worthless because they lacked formal credentials began to understand that their knowledge had value, that their experiences mattered, that they had contributions to make. The Grand Dandy Pond Hotel had transformed under Naya's leadership, becoming something more than just a place of accommodation. It had become a symbol of what was possible when dignity replaced hierarchy, when listening replaced assuming, when humanity replaced mere efficiency. The hotel's success metrics told part of the story. Occupancy rates up 45%. Revenue doubled, guest satisfaction scores at an all-time high. International organizations began specifically requesting to hold events there, knowing that the cultural sensitivity and genuine hospitality they would receive was unmatched. But the numbers didn't capture the full transformation. The hotel had become a place where every staff member felt valued. The person cleaning your room might tell you about the agricultural practices of their home region. The security guard might recommend the best local musicians. The kitchen staff might share stories of their grandmother's recipes that had been passed down through generations. Guests frequently commented that staying at the Grand Dandy Pond felt less like checking into a hotel and more like being welcomed into a community. Many kept in touch with staff members long after their visits, building genuine relationships that crossed typical service boundaries. One American journalist who came to write a story about Naya spent a week at the hotel and ended up writing, "I came expecting to find either a fraud or a saint. Instead, I found something more valuable, an ordinary woman who had the extraordinary courage to insist that ordinary people matter. And I found a hotel that somehow made me feel more human than most places I've visited." In a world increasingly dominated by algorithms and automation, where service is optimized for efficiency rather than connection, this hotel reminded me what hospitality really means, seeing the humanity in both the guest and the server. The article helped shift international perception. Critics who had dismissed Naya as a populist symbol had to confront the concrete reality that her approach actually worked, that it produced both moral value and economic success. But Naya herself remained focused on the mission rather than the validation. She continued to push for deeper changes, even when they were uncomfortable. As the Ubuntu movement grew, it inevitably encountered complex challenges that couldn't be solved by inspiring speeches alone. One of the most significant came when a medical crisis forced the movement to confront the limits of experiential knowledge. A traditional healer who had become one of the most celebrated living books in the program claimed he could cure cancer with herbal treatments. When a patient died after foregoing conventional treatment to use the healer's methods, the backlash was swift and severe. Critics pounced. "This is exactly what we warned about." Valorizing traditional knowledge without recognizing the importance of scientific validation leads to deaths. Naya faced one of the hardest decisions of her leadership. She had to publicly acknowledge that the Ubuntu initiative had made a mistake, that recognizing traditional knowledge didn't mean accepting all claims uncritically, that there needed to be frameworks for safety and verification. "We believed in honoring all knowledge," she said in a painful press conference, "but we failed to distinguish between different types of knowledge and different types of claims. Traditional healing has real value, but it doesn't replace modern medicine. Language learning through immersion is legitimate, but so is formal linguistic study. We were so focused on validating what had been dismissed that we overcorrected, suggesting that all knowledge is equally valid for all purposes. That was wrong. The admission cost her politically. Some supporters felt betrayed, arguing that she had capitulated to Western pressure. Critics claimed it proved the whole movement was fundamentally flawed. President Traoré stood by her. "What you just did," he told her privately, "took more courage than your UN speech. It's easy to inspire people with vision. It's much harder to tell them when you've made mistakes, when reality is more complex than slogans." The Ubuntu initiative implemented new guidelines. Traditional knowledge would be honored and preserved, but would also be studied, tested, and integrated with modern scientific understanding where appropriate. The goal was synthesis, not rejection of either traditional or modern knowledge. This more nuanced approach was harder to communicate, less inspiring in sound bites, but ultimately more sustainable. It acknowledged what Naya had known all along but hadn't fully articulated. The point wasn't to replace one system with another, but to create space for multiple ways of knowing to coexist and enrich each other. The public controversy took a personal toll on Naya. The criticism, the pressure, the constant scrutiny, it all accumulated into a weight that became increasingly difficult to bear. She began having panic attacks, waking in the middle of the night convinced she had made a terrible mistake, that she had hurt more people than she had helped, that she should have stayed quiet and invisible. President Traoré noticed her struggling during a meeting and insisted she take time off. You cannot pour from an empty cup, he told her. You've given everything to this movement. Now you need to refill yourself. Naya returned to her village, or what remained of it. The war that had destroyed her childhood home was long over, and some families had returned to rebuild. She stayed with a distant cousin, spending days simply walking the land, sitting under trees, remembering who she had been before the world made demands of her. An old woman from the village, someone who had known Naya's mother, came to sit with her one afternoon. They sat in silence for a long time before the elder spoke. "Your mother would be proud," she said simply. Naya began to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place she had been holding locked away. "I don't know if I'm helping or hurting," she said between tears. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this." The old woman took Naya's hand. "Strength is not never breaking. Strength is breaking and continuing anyway. You've given voice to millions who had none. That was never going to be easy or simple. Important things never are." They sat together until the sun set, and Naya felt something in her begin to heal, not completely, but enough to imagine continuing. When Naya returned to Ouagadougou after 3 weeks, she had changed. She was quieter, less certain in her pronouncements, more willing to admit when she didn't have answers. Some saw this as weakness, but others recognized it as maturity, the evolution from symbol to leader. She refocused the Ubuntu initiative on something she felt certain about: education for children that honored both traditional and modern knowledge. Schools in the program would teach mathematics and science alongside traditional stories, formal language instruction alongside cultural immersion, individual achievement alongside community responsibility. The first Ubuntu school opened in Ouagadougou. Children spent mornings in traditional academic classes and afternoons with living books. Community members who taught traditional crafts, languages, farming, cooking, storytelling, and music. Naya visited regularly, and the children came to love her visits because she never talked down to them, never pretended to have all the answers. One day, a 10-year-old girl asked her, "Miss Naya, if you could go back and change your life, would you?" Naya thought carefully before answering. "I would change the wars that destroyed my home and killed my family. I would change the poverty and displacement that caused so much suffering. But my journey from cleaning woman to where I am now, no, I wouldn't change that. Because every step, even the painful ones, taught me something essential about dignity, about resilience, about the humanity that connects us all." The girl nodded seriously. "My father is a mechanic. He doesn't have papers, but he can fix anything. Before I was embarrassed. Now I'm proud. Hold on to that pride," Naya said. "And also go to school. Learn everything you can, formal and informal. Don't choose one kind of knowledge over another. Gather all the knowledge you can from wherever you can find it." This became Naya's refined message, not rejection of formal education, but expansion of what counted as education. Not dismissal of credentials, but refusal to let credentials be the only measure of worth 5 years after her UN speech. Naya stood again in the Grand Dandy Pond Hotel lobby. She came regularly, not just to oversee management, but to remember. The cleaning cart she had once pushed was displayed now in the lobby as a piece of art, with a plaque that read, "Every journey begins somewhere. Every person has value. May we never forget to see both." The hotel was thriving. The Ubuntu initiative had spread to 37 African nations and was being studied and adapted in Latin, America, and Asia. The Living Library project had registered over 2 million living books. Across the continent, universities were reforming curricula to incorporate experiential knowledge. Hiring practices were slowly changing, but Naya knew the work was far from complete. She knew that changing systems required generations, not just years. She knew that every gain could be reversed, that vigilance was permanent. Still, when she looked around, at the hotel staff working with dignity and pride, at the young people embracing both traditional and modern knowledge, at the continent slowly learning to value its own people, she allowed herself to feel satisfaction. President Traoré, now near the end of his term, came to visit her at the hotel. They sat in the lobby, just 2 people having tea, though security guards watched discreetly from a distance. You changed our country, he said. You changed our continent. Naya shook her head. I held up a mirror. The change was always there, waiting. I just helped people see it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while before Naya asked, Do you ever regret appointing me? It would have been easier to choose someone with traditional credentials. Easier? Traoré laughed. Perhaps better? Never. You were exactly what we needed. A reminder that our greatest resources are our people. All our people, not just those with diplomas and degrees. As he left, Naya remained in the lobby, watching people come and go. Business people and tourists, families and solo travelers, Africans and foreigners, all of them benefiting from a hotel that had learned to see the humanity in everyone, that had learned that service was not servitude, that hospitality was not hierarchy. A young woman in a cleaning uniform approached shyly. Miss Naya, I'm new here. I just wanted to say, I speak 3 languages. I was afraid to mention it because I thought it didn't matter for this job. But my supervisor said you encourage us to use our skills. Is that true? Naya smiled. It's true. What languages do you speak? Hausa, Fulani, and English. Then you are a treasure to this hotel and to our guests. Never hide your gifts. Never make yourself smaller than you are. Promise me. The young woman nodded, tears in her eyes. I promise. As she walked away, Naya whispered to herself, The revolution continues. One person at a time. One moment of recognition at a time. One reminder that we all matter. A decade after Naya's initial appointment, the Grand Dandy Pond Hotel hosted a special event, the 10th anniversary celebration of the Ubuntu Uprising. Leaders from across Africa gathered, along with scholars, activists, and most importantly, ordinary people whose lives had been touched by the movement. Naya, now in her 50s, watched from the side as speaker after speaker told stories of transformation. A farmer whose traditional knowledge of drought-resistant crops had been documented and shared, saving thousands during a severe drought. A mechanic who had trained hundreds of young people in his craft, creating a whole new generation of skilled workers. A grandmother whose language preservation work had saved a dying tongue from extinction. When it was finally Naya's turn to speak, she approached the microphone slowly. Her hair was streaked with gray now, her face lined with the marks of time and responsibility. But her eyes still held that quality that had first caught President Traoré's attention, a depth of understanding that came from having lived fully, from having suffered and survived and found meaning in the struggle. 10 years ago, she began, I was invisible. I pushed a cleaning cart through this hotel, and people looked through me as if I were a ghost. I believed what society told me, that I was nobody, that my life didn't matter, that my knowledge and experience had no value. Then someone saw me. President Traoré saw me, truly saw me, and in being seen, I remembered how to see myself. That gift of recognition changed my life. But what I've learned in these 10 years is that my story was never just about me. There are millions of invisible people across this continent and across the world. People who clean your offices and drive your cars and grow your food and fix your machines and raise your children. People who speak multiple languages and practice traditional crafts and hold deep knowledge and demonstrate daily courage. People who matter enormously but are treated as if they matter not at all. The Ubuntu Uprising was never about rejecting education or dismissing credentials. It was about expanding our definition of value, about recognizing that there are many kinds of knowledge, many kinds of intelligence, many paths to wisdom. It was about insisting that human dignity is not conditional on having certain papers or achieving certain status. We have not solved everything. Poverty still exists. Inequality persists. Many people still struggle to have their worth recognized. But we have planted seeds. We have opened conversations. We have created spaces where people can be seen and valued for all that they are, not just for what certificates they hold. That is enough. Not to stop striving, but to know that the work has meaning, that change is possible, that every person who finds the courage to claim their own worth, to refuse invisibility, to insist on their own dignity, every person who does that continues this revolution. She paused, looking out at the crowd. I began as a cleaning woman. I may end as one too, because that work has dignity. All honest work has dignity. What matters is not the work itself, but whether we are seen, valued, and treated with respect while we do it. So my final message is simple. See each other. Value each other. Never let anyone convince you that some humans matter more than others. We are all Ubuntu. I am because we are. And when we truly understand that, when we truly live it, everything becomes possible. The standing ovation lasted 10 minutes. But what Naya remembered most was what happened after. How people lined up not to congratulate her, but to share their own stories. Each one a variation on the same theme. I was invisible, but now I am seen. I was dismissed, but now I am valued. I was told I was nothing, but now I know I am something. Late that night, Naya stood alone in the hotel lobby in the exact spot where she had been standing 10 years earlier when President Traoré first heard her speaking multiple languages. She closed her eyes and remembered that moment, the fear, the surprise, the trembling hope that maybe, possibly, her life could be different. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was thanking. Fate, perhaps. Or the people who had sheltered her across the years. Or President Traoré for having the courage to see potential where others saw only a uniform. Or maybe herself for having the courage to accept the opportunity when it came, terrifying as it was. She opened her eyes and looked at her reflection in the polished lobby windows. "You did well," she told herself. You did well. And finally, after all these years, she believed it. The end.